Now let's focus on active immunity and passive immunity, and let's discuss a concept known as immunization. Now let's begin by discussing how the natural process of infection takes place and what our body does to fight off that infection. So let's suppose we have a cut in our skin and the pathogen makes their way into our body. What happens is infection begins, and as soon as infection begins, the innate immunity of our immune system kicks in and it begins the process of inflammation. Now, what inflammation does is it ultimately aims to block off that infection, to localize that infection to a specific location in our body, and that prevents that infection, the pathogen, from actually spreading to other parts of our body. Now, at the same time that inflammation is taking place, the adaptive immunity of our immune system begins to mobilize, it begins to activate itself. And what happens is special white blood cells of the adaptive immunity begin to form. So we have plasma cells and we have memory cells. Plasma cells are those white blood cells that produce antibodies specific to that invading antigen. And these antibodies are released into our blood, our lymph, and our tissue. And when the antibodies bind onto that antigen, they label that antigen for destruction by other white blood cells. And so that calls upon macrophages, natural killer cells, cytotoxic T cells, and many other different types of white blood cells to that area, and that destroys that pathogen along with its antigen. Now, this is basically how our immune system defends and protects our body from these invading pathogens. Now, following our infection, our body develops something called active immunity. And what that means is our body develops these memory cells. And these memory cells contain a copy of the antibody that is specific to that antigen that infected our body in the first place. And what that is useful for if we are ever reinfected by that same pathogen that contains that same antigen, we have these memory B cells that can now initiate a very quick and a very rapid response, and we actually won't feel the same exact effect that we felt the first time when we were infected by that pathogen. So the process of active immunity is a process in which our body develops immunity, these memory cells, to the pathogen by being directly exposed to our antigens. For example, people who are exposed to chickenpox gain active immunity and will be very unlikely to ever feel that same effect they felt the first time when they were exposed. Now, there are two processes by which we can gain active immunity. What we just discussed a moment ago is a natural process. So active immunity can be achieved either naturally through some type of exposure to that pathogen, for example, an infection, which is what we discussed earlier, or we can actually induce active immunity artificially via a process known as immunization. And immunization involves injecting something called vaccines into our body. So what exactly is a vaccine? So a vaccine is essentially this little test tube that contains some sort of pathogen inside that test tube. Now, the pathogen has been altered in some way or form. It has been inoculated, and what that means is we change that pathogen in the laboratory, and we change it in such a way to ensure that it does not damage the body as severely as it would normally when we are infected by that pathogen in a natural way. Now, in both of these cases, in the natural case and in the artificial case, we obtain the same exact result. We essentially either inject or somehow obtain these antigens. Our immune system begins to develop antibodies as well as memory cells that contain a copy of that antibody in case we are ever reinfected. And that's how we develop something called active immunity. So vaccines are normally developed in laboratories by many different methods that we're not going to focus on in this lecture. Typically, the pathogen is inoculated, which means that it is changed in some way or form as to ensure that not too much damage is actually taken by the body, so that we don't feel the same exact bad effect that we would normally feel in the natural process of infection. And in many cases, receiving a vaccine essentially creates no effects whatsoever, no effects that we can actually visibly see or physically feel. Now, to further prevent us from actually experiencing any form of discomfort during vaccination, what medical researchers do is they essentially kill off that pathogen altogether, and they only take a very small portion of an antigen of that pathogen. So they essentially cut that pathogen and use only the epitope, the antigenic determinant of that antigen, because it's that part of the antigen that ultimately binds to the antibodies of our body. And in this way, the body can still produce antibodies following vaccination, and at the same time, it will create a very, very little effects that will actually hurt the body. Now, everything we discussed so far is active immunity, and active immunity involves developing our memory cells, and we said we can gain active immunity either artificially or either via natural means when infection actually takes place. Now let's discuss something called passive immunity. Passive immunity basically means we do not develop any memory B cells or memory T cells. And that's because we actually inject antibodies directly into our blood, into our lymph, or into our tissue. And by injecting the antibodies, we're not exposing the immune system to our antigens, and so we're not giving our immune system, the adaptive immunity of our immune system, the chance to actually develop those antibodies themselves. So another form of immunity is called passive immunity. In passive immunity, antibodies are developed in the laboratory that are specific to some particular pathogen. And these antibodies, when they're injected into our body, they begin to circulate in our blood system, in our lymph system, and in our tissue. And if we are exposed to that pathogen that carries that antigen that is complementary to the antibody that was injected into our body in the first place, those antibodies will bind onto those antigens. The artificial antibodies will bind onto the antigens, and that will initiate a response in which it will label those antigens as well as the pathogen for destruction by our white blood cells. Now, one very important point about passive immunity, once again, is it does not develop memory cells. And so this means that eventually these antibodies will be degraded inside our body and they will cease to exist. And at that point, we will lose our immunity. And that's exactly why this is called passive immunity. It only persists for several months following injection of those antibodies, while active immunity usually persists for the duration of our lifetime. So we saw that active immunity can be acquired naturally or artificially, and so far we discussed the artificial process by which we gain passive immunity. So we actually synthesize those antibodies in a lab. Now, it turns out that we also have a natural way to obtain passive immunity, and this takes place in a woman when a woman is pregnant with a child. So, passive immunity can also be developed naturally. Pregnant women give their developing fetus passive immunity by producing specific antibodies known as immunoglobulins G. And immunoglobulins G are small enough to actually pass across the placental membrane and into the blood, found inside our fetus. And what that gives the fetus is passive immunity to any type of antigen or pathogen that might infect that fetus. And this is important because as the fetus is developing, his or her immune system is also developing. So it's important that during this process of development, our fetus has an ability to fight off an infection that infects that mother. Now, another way we pass down or we create passive immunity naturally is via the process of breastfeeding. So the milk that is found in women during the process of breastfeeding contains yet another type of immunoglobulin antibody known as immunoglobulin A. And once our child gains the immunoglobulin A via the milk, via the process of breastfeeding, that boosts their immune system because the child's immune system is still developing following childbirth. So this is basically a diagram, a flowchart that describes everything we just discussed. It summarizes our results, our discussion. So we have our immune system that is split into two categories. So the innate immune system that begins to act immediately after infection. It involves cells like macrophages, neutrophils, and so forth. And then we have our adaptive immunity that develops over some period of time because it has to synthesize the plasma cells, the memory cells, as well as other cells such as helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells. Now, adaptive immunity can be split into two. We have artificial and we have natural. And each one of these can be split into active and passive. So basically, during the process of vaccination, during the process of immunization, when we take a vaccine and we inject it into that organism, into that individual, we inject an inoculated form of that pathogen. And what that does is it gives us active immunity by not having to experience the same exact detrimental effects that we would naturally experience if we are infected in a natural way. Now, in this process, we gain memory cells. If we examine the natural process, we have to get the actual infection from that pathogen. We have to be infected by that pathogen to gain the same exact response to basically form those same memory cells that contain the antibodies. So both of these two are two methods of gaining active immunity. One is via an artificial, so immunization via a vaccine, and the other one is a natural via the process of infection. Now, what about the temporary process of passive immunity, which basically injects in one way or form antibodies into our body, and those antibodies can bind onto the pathogenic antigens, labeling them for destruction. So we also have artificial and natural. Now, artificial includes actually taking those antibodies, injecting those antibodies into our body, and allowing those antibodies to circulate our system. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't produce any memory cells, and so after several months, we essentially lose any immunity that we initially had as a result of that passive immunity. And we also have the natural process of passive immunity, as we discussed just a moment ago. So antibodies transfer via the placenta when the woman is essentially pregnant, or during the process of breastfeeding when the milk is transferred to that child, along with those immunoglobulins, specifically immunoglobulin A. So we conclude that immunization is a very useful process of actually giving our body active immunity, the ability to fight off infections if we are ever actually infected with some particular viral or bacterial agent. For example, we have vaccinations for things like polio, botulism, tetanus. We also have vaccination for the whooping cough, as well as many other lethal pathogenic infections and pathogenic agents.